much, Chris. I'll kick us off and remind folks we love questions. We've saved about 2/3 of this time, sorry, 1/3 of this time for questions. So please ask away. I'm Yvette. I'm a fractional CTO, CPTO consultant for different companies, and an advisor. I was a CTO, head of product and engineering for about 10 years before this, and was a manager and started off my career as a software engineer. I'll pass it over to Margaret.
Hi, everyone. I currently work as a technology advisor to a few venture firms. So I work with Andreessen Horowitz, Google Ventures, and a small incubator called AAA Partners. Currently all in the healthcare space. Before that, I was CTO at Devoted Health, and then I actually started my career as an engineer at an ad tech company, spent time in consumer tech, government, biotech research, all in data and engineering leadership roles.
Awesome. So we're gonna get going. Margaret and I have both spent a lot of our time advising companies on who and how to hire their product and or engineering leader. So that's why we were excited to talk about this topic. We're going to spend about 25 minutes going over 5 key lessons that we've learned doing this for so many years now, and then we'll save a great amount of time for Q&A. So let's dive right into it. I'll kick us off, and we'd love to talk about, one big problem that you often face is how do you decide on the level? How do you decide on the type of leader that you need? And Margaret, I'll throw it over to you to give us your thoughts there, and I'll chime in after.
Yeah. So, and just for a little context, I probably in the last year spent time with about 40 healthcare startups, like mostly seed and Series A, a few slightly more mature Series C, and so and in many cases, I'm part of helping figure out what kind of technology leader a team might need, evaluating current technology leaders, and thinking through what gaps there are on the team that folks might want to fill. So through that purview, I would say that I would bifurcate this question to what kind of leader do you need and what kind of leader can you hire? Because the one you need is not always available to you if you're a seed stage company with maybe $5 million check from a venture firm that's not as well known, and you don't happen to have a rich network of really strong technical leaders. Like your wish list for what you want might not exactly match up with what you're going to be able to hire. So with that in mind, I think there's a couple different areas to think about. One is your company tech enabled or tech first? So what I mean by that is, are you a services business that requires strong technology to run good operations? Or are you actually building a technology product that somebody's going to buy? And that has pretty different implications for the kind of technology leader that you want, including how hands-on they might be, the technical vision that you might want them to have. And I would say that those would skew strongly in the tech first product. The other is, or another lens to think through is stage. So what's more important to you right now, a doer or a vision setter? Like early on, probably you need more of a doer, like as founders or early team members who have raised money, hopefully you have a vision for the next year or 2 or 3, but who's going to start making that vision turn into reality? So I would tend towards folks that are willing and able to be hands-on right away. You also want to think about management experience. Like if you're early stage, there might not be anyone to manage, but in another year or so, there might. Can this person flex into that? Do they want to? And then also cross-functional expert experience, like have they led data or product before? Those naturally can fold into technology leadership areas, or have they not? And are you gonna have to hire other team members to compensate for that? And then I think we'll talk about this more later, but it's important to think about it in the context of what type of leader do you need, which is, are you going to be compensating for the rest of the executive team with this hire? In other words, if you have a less experienced founding team, like maybe this is their first startup, maybe they haven't been in executive roles, or their first, founding startup, they haven't been in executive roles at other companies, you might be looking for a technical leader that can also be a great peer leader. So it's another kind of dimension to think about it on. Yvette, do you
Yeah,
want to add more?
totally. Great points. Yeah. Great points, Margaret. I'm always trying to disagree with you. This is going to be hard. I work for a lot of Series A through C companies as well. I've worked with about 10 in the last year, and almost every one of them, I've helped them hire either a VP, head of, or C-level engineering product leader. And really similarly, I think a lot of the answer is it depends. One of the things that I see CEOs, founders, heads of people trick themselves about too much or not really think honestly about is, do they really need an exec, right? Do they want an exec? Do they want another person who's going to be speaking with their board, discussing and coming up with and pushing back on company strategy? Do they want another executive team member? Do they need one? Does the current exec team want an executive team member? Before you go off and hire a C-level person, make sure the answer to all of those things is yes. Don't hire a C-level person and not put them in front of the board, right? Or, be really honest with yourself. Do you really just want someone who's going to focus on execution and delivery, who's going to focus more specifically on the tech or product strategy, who's going to be a leadership team member, but not an exec team member driving the company strategy and vision? I often see folks say they want one thing, but either need or act like they want another. And I agree with you a lot about like what are you building, right? Is your company business or product about B2B enterprise sales? Is it about integrations with other platforms? Is it about your data? Companies like that lean more in the direction of you probably need someone who's way stronger on the engineering side. Or are you building a consumer-facing direct-to-consumer product? Is it about engagement, right? You probably need someone stronger on the product side who's done that before. Hey, Margaret, why don't you walk us through this next topic?
Well, this is the one that nobody wants to do, but everybody ends up having to do. So, working with an external search firm, Yvette, what do you think?
So I mean, first off, don't let a CEO, founder, head of people, exec team, if you're one of those people who's saying, I can do this myself, I don't need help, don't worry, I've got a great network. My big advice there is don't YOLO it. It's probably not going to work. Don't do it yourself. I think it's important to hire someone who's going to be really focused on this, whether or not you have that person internally. You might have a great head of people who can run this, great, but this has to be one of their top priorities. And if not, hire an external search firm. And again, don't kid yourself. Don't cheap out. If you have a head of people who's going to spend a few hours a week on this, you're probably never going to hire the person you need unless you really look out. As far as hiring firms, I like to hire people and not firms. I've found a lot of variability in the big recruiting firms. I've found a lot better results with hiring partners, people I've worked with at firms, and sometimes those folks move. I also love finding smaller boutique firms or folks who've gone out on their own, who you're going to get their undivided attention, and they're not going to farm it out to a few junior people who are going to spam, every day and send out 500 emails and try to get replies. But I think one of the biggest things is I think founder CEOs get in their own way by saying things like, I know how to interview senior people, don't worry about it. I don't need interview plans. I don't need interview loops. I'm going to run this one on my own. And I've just seen time and time again, the CEO founder never really has time to organize that and do it. And if they're not going to create interview plans and loops, someone needs to. So that's a big recommendation I have is, don't YOLO that either. You might luck out, but it's almost always going to lead to longer hiring cycles, getting poor candidate signals. The companies I've worked with, I've come into almost every one of them, and part of my role has been to organize the executive team's thoughts on what's really important for this candidate. How are we going to get the signals, and what interview plan is going to get us there? Margaret, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. Like, no matter what anyone tells you, including your investors, if you're a Series A or B company looking for a VP level person, like, unless you get really lucky, which does happen, you're gonna have to use a search firm, so you have to adjust your mindset. It's also going to be expensive, and you're gonna have to do a lot more work than you think you will. It's not like you just sign up and magically amazing candidates come forward. I agree with Yvette that it's worth looking at one-person shops. They tend to be much more experienced. I mean, there are people with 20 years of recruiting experience who are themselves reaching out to the candidates, versus at larger firms, you can have more junior employees who are doing that outreach. And I think there's just like potentially better responses to those more experienced recruiters. There can be benefits to working with larger firms too, if they know your industry really well. But even in that case, I think you're going to have to steer them to the right candidates. I would consider, if you can, having like a CTO advisor that can help you with all of this. So help you with role definition, or maybe it's a CPO, depending on what, whether you're hiring VP of product or VP of technology, but somebody who can help you define the role, like what actually are you trying to solve for in your company, help you figure out the search criteria. Whenever you work with these firms, they're going to send you, after a couple of meetings, like, okay, here's some example candidates. It's helpful to have somebody who can react with some depth to whether those candidates are good matches or not, and kind of steer the search firm one way or the other. And then you can have this person do like tech-oriented interviews. So now some companies may have founding CEOs who are engineers, in which case you may not need that. But for companies that don't have kind of internal expertise in technology and product, I would think about that.
Yeah, I've probably interviewed, I don't know, 60 candidates this year. You probably interviewed more, I'm guessing, in that role as like CPO, CTO, SME. And at least from what my clients have said, they find that really valuable. And I think the hour and a half I spend on each candidate is really like probably one of the most valuable uses of my time. So our next topic is, how much of a practitioner should a CPO, CTO, head of product, head of engineering be? And I'll let Margaret share your thoughts with us.
So I think there's two versions of this. One kind of goes back to what are you building and what skill set do you need right off the bat. So obviously, if you're seed Series A and you're building a tech product, like from my perspective, you want somebody who can weigh in deeply on architecture, product, some extent have be contributing themselves to that code. But I would say even outside of that realm, I like candidates who have kind of gone through waves of being close to the code and further away. I think at a certain point, it becomes very hard to give your team feedback and direct your teams to do the right thing if you're not steeped in the technology. So that doesn't mean that you're coding, that like at the existing job, you're coding all the time, and then you're going to move into the new job and code all the time and manage off that. But has this person demonstrated that sometimes in moments they go back and they contribute to code themselves, they data architect things themselves. Again, because I think in these early stage companies, you want somebody with experience who's kind of directing traffic. And if the leader isn't able to like dive down and do a code review or like give feedback on the architecture, then you're leaving these kind of key decisions to much less experienced engineers.
Yeah, I think it's similar on the product side as well. I love, I've hired a few head of product candidates recently. Um, and I do ask questions about research and discovery, and I love candidates who have done and consider it a huge part of their job to still be in the product craft of doing research, looking at data, doing discovery themselves, potentially being able to step in and be the product leader for a really big key company initiative, or even just step down at a Series A or B company when they need to, and be more hands-on, guiding and leading teams from the product side. I think it's really important. I typically think that it's probably right to err on the side of hiring someone who is very capable of being more of a practitioner than you need, because they can get really close to the work. And I think one of the big failure modes, and we'll talk about this topic later, um, that I've seen is hiring leaders who are too far removed from the work and not in it with the team, especially when you're talking about a Series A, B company. Um, I also I also think it really depends on I think asking CEOs and founders to be honest with themselves again about what type of leader they're looking to hire. While I think all leaders should be able to be strong practitioners, especially at earlier stage companies, whether you ask them to do that or not is a really different thing. And I think asking a C-level role to write code almost at any stage is somewhat of a failure mode there too, because either you've leveled the wrong role and you really needed a VP or head of engineering, asking a CPO to hands-on product manage a 5-person squad long term is also probably a failure mode. You probably needed more of a VP head of product. So be honest with yourself about what you really need, how much of a practitioner you want them to be, and what level that is. Margaret, you want to talk about domain
Well,
experience?
I currently work in a single domain, healthcare. So I have some thoughts about that domain, but what do you think?
Well, I take a little bit of a spicy viewpoint on domain. Um, I, you know, I think for most industries, for most companies, domain experience is almost never a top 3 thing on my list. I think you can often, or you often have an exec team that has pretty strong, or you have a company that has pretty strong domain experience already. And sure, you can look for a unicorn who fits all of your criteria and has domain experience. Go for it, try to find that person, but I would pull the plug a month or 2 into a search if it's proving that you're either finding people with domain experience and not the right other skill sets, because I think that's also really tough. And I've seen folks tend to compromise and hire too much for domain experience and not the other skill sets. So I think in most industries, I wouldn't pick domain experience as my top 3. And I think a smart leader will be able to learn that in 6-ish months, plus or minus. I think there are some industries like finance, like healthcare, where it's really complicated and it probably does matter. There's also some situations where you're earlier stage and your runway is not long and you need someone to jump in there and not take six months to have a really big immediate impact on business or product strategy. And in that case, maybe you hire for a domain. But I'm pretty negative on domain versus a lot of other folks. But Margaret, you work in one of those industries where I think it's important. I'd love to hear your take.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that caveat because we were gonna have a big disagreement without that.
Oh, that would have been so much
Um,
fun.
I think in healthcare, I mean, it can depend, but it's I would say the default should be it's required that you have domain expertise. It's so there's so much breadth of topics to cover and they go so deep. Some of them are regulatory, get in trouble. A lot of them are around contracts, which are very detail oriented that you like, if you get that wrong, you don't have a business. There's also a significant cultural part to working in healthcare companies where the technology teams are interacting directly with clinicians or operators that are not used to working, like this is sort of in the modern healthcare startup, they're not used to working with technology teams directly. And there can be big differences in communication or expectations or sense of ownership. And in my experience, you need to have somebody who's kind of comes in already knowing the scene that they're going to arrive in. I think a lot of people get reject like the body rejects the whatever, like, you know, you hire a really exciting VP of engineering from a Silicon Valley company and they come into a healthcare company and they're like, oh, this is how you work or this is what it's like, and they don't want to be there, and the team is also like, that's like you're you know, negating the experiences of the nurses on the team. It's interesting for me to say all of that because I came into healthcare as a non-healthcare person, but I came in as an early engineer on a team that was most of the rest of the engineering team came from Athena Health. The founders came from Athena Health, and all the early people were like deep operational healthcare folks. And so I had the benefit of learning alongside all those people. But if somebody had just hired me to be CTO of Devoted, I would have failed for sure. So yeah, I'll go long on healthcare. I imagine it might be true in finance. I'm not as familiar with finance. I think in other areas where the business model is much simpler, maybe it doesn't matter too much, but I also think it can be a really big level up for a leader to have that also, to be able to anticipate. Like if you're a SaaS business, and somebody's coming from SaaS and they can be like, oh yeah, you got to architect from the beginning your data warehouse or your database this way. You have to think about authentication this way. And they've kind of learned that from mistakes they've made in other places or business that's similar. Again, I don't know if it's required, but I think it can be a real significant boost.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. You know, my first healthcare job, I knew nothing about it too, and very similar to you, I was surrounded by a leadership team that was really deep in healthcare, but they had no idea how to ship software product, right? So that's how I was helping, but I learned a ton in my year there. I also agree. I have seen, you know, potentially even more than domain, I have seen the business model be a big up level for someone. So if you're a B2B to C business, hiring someone who has that B2B to C experience and understands the complexity of selling to both a business and an end user. You know, similarly, if someone's done a lot of D2C or straight up B2B, I think sometimes that as much as industry could be a big win. All right, so coming upon our last topic here. So you've hired this great person, your CTO, your CPO is hired, they're onboarded. How do you know they're doing a good job? And I know, Margaret, you were pretty passionate about this one, so I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Well, I mean, I think there's kind of the basics of like feedback from peers, like are they easy to collaborate with, or um, is progress being made? Like, what does that executive team think of this person? Um, but I think there's a couple others that you should just be watching out for. One is how fast are they moving and how fast are they getting the team to move? Even if you yourself can't judge, like, is this the right code or is this like right product? Like if they have gotten the engineering team onto a fast cycle of changes, deployments, they're kind of moving through the roadmap quickly. I think that's a really good indicator. And the converse would be if you as a founder or leader are like always wondering, when's the thing gonna ship? Like, are we aligned on what we're gonna build? Like, those are definitely signals that you gotta fix soon, because that's not gonna get better. That's only gonna get worse over time. And then another one would be, are they a bottleneck? So are they taking on either more than they should, or, and it's related, are they hiring an experienced enough team so that the team becomes high leverage, high throughput over time? Sometimes you have people come into scenarios where there's a lot of work to do and they are a doer. And so like, I'm just going to roll up my sleeves and do it. And that's good for like 25% of the time, but you have to, with the rest of your time, be figuring out and getting people in the door, who you're going to hire and getting them in the door, who are going to be very impactful. So those are a couple of things that I would be watching out for.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned speed. I think that's a huge one. I think the best leaders you hire, they move fast and maybe even faster than you think they'd move, but it doesn't feel too fast, right? They're bringing everyone along for the ride. But one of the one of the toughest things I've seen with leaders who don't work out, one of the first signals you see is like, why aren't they moving faster with everything, with hiring, with roadmap, with setting goals, with their team, right? Like just why? And you have to dig in. I'm a big data person, both qual and quant data. So I think that that speed of achieving outcomes, metrics, goals is really important. And the qualitative side of the data is talk with people, right? If you're their boss, talk with your directs who are their peers, ask for feedback, do some skip levels, talk with the leaders, directs, get some qualitative feedback, because sometimes you can learn a ton that you're not seeing yourself or seeing from the data. So those are the topics that we have, and I'd love to turn it over to some Q&A for the rest of the time we have together.
All right, thanks so much, guys. We have a few questions coming in. The first is from Mark Weeks. Mark asks, which recruiting firms have you had or people have you had success with in the past and would recommend engaging?
So I think for larger search firms, it really depends on the partner you work with. A lot of firms have nice brand names, and probably for good reason, but it doesn't, just because you go with a certain name doesn't mean that the partner that you work with or the people that are on the project are going to be awesome. So I don't know that I would say like, oh yeah, I work with these 3 firms and like everything's going to be great. You really need to vet the partner that you're going to work with.
Yeah, and it's such an individual choice. I like hesitate to give some names of folks I've liked working with who've either got me a job or I've hired through, because it's just so specific to what you're looking for and how you like to work. I will throw just one of them out there because it's more of a boutique name that folks might not have heard of. Jody Jefferson at the People Project is one of my favorite exec recruiters for engineering, data, and product leaders. You know, she's based in New York, so it's great for me to be able to meet with someone in person still. But there's so many firms and there's so many names out there, and I really think, you know, like building your network of people you like to work with is probably the best way to go.
Love it. Steph McDonald has 2 great questions. Her first is, do you consider someone coming from your own domain might bring biases from their past experience? I hear this is how we did it at insert company name, and we should consider that here. And I'm curious how you prevent those types of assumptions.
Yes, I think there's pros and cons.
Go ahead.
You're getting that domain experience. I think it's important for your overall team to be diverse. So whether that's coming from different companies or different domains, and that you encourage a culture where people are free to share their opinions, challenge assumptions. So I think you compensate for that risk by creating that open environment with diversity of opinions. I would not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, because there might be bias here, I'm not going to hire from this domain. The other thing I would say is that you can kind of weed out in the interview process, like, does this person build things in a way, like healthcare is an easy one to pick on. Does this person build things in a way that they were doing in healthcare 20 years ago and they haven't updated how they think about technology in that time period? And that in that case, like, you don't want that vibe, but are they open? Are they excited to try new things? Have they tried new things at their current employer? I think those are all good indicators that they're not going to be stuck in the past.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think when you're interviewing folks, you really want to find folks who are curious, ask questions first, systems thinkers. Because even if in the back of their head they started a company and they see the same exact problem, you want them to think in the framework they'd use to solve the problem. And it would be great if they have a battle-tested framework and they're a systems thinker who's used the same framework and iterated and made it better over and over to solve a certain set of problems versus a specific playbook for the problem, right? So I think using the right interview questions, behavioral interviews to find folks who are curious, going to ask questions and apply what they've learned in the past, not exactly, but as a framework and a system to solving it. So I do think it is worrisome when you have folks who've come in and have just said, well, this is how we did it at X versus said something like, well, this is how we solved this kind of problem at X. So let's apply, let's try out that framework here and let's see, like, where does that lead us here, right?
Awesome. Steph, I'm gonna move past your second question for now to get some other voices, but we'll come back to it if we have time. The next question is from Cameron Bertine. They ask, how do co-founders without C-level experience continue to lead after hiring C-levels in the areas that founders need support and mentorship in?
That's a good question. Not one I've thought about much on this topic. Like, one suggestion is I know there are a lot of CEO founder coaches out there. Get a great one. As I've been building my own fractional CPO, CTO practice, I've come across a handful of like great new CEO founder coaches that I've heard of. Either my direct clients are either using or they're looking for one. So it's probably not my area of expertise to coach the founder or CEO as much. But I'd highly recommend being self-actualized and humble enough to kind of jump on that bandwagon. It's really lonely to be a founder and a CEO. It's really hard, especially if you don't have a co-founder. And my understanding, I haven't been a founder of a company of more than one before. And, my understanding is as you go through those high and low points and pivots and changes, it only doesn't get any easier. So having someone to share that with would probably be good. Another Lara Hogan is a engineering leader and coach that I've worked on and off with for the past bunch of years, and she has this concept of your Voltron, and that's the group of close folks who are experts in different areas that you can go to for advice and help. Like, I've actually used Margaret as my Voltron, right? She's someone who has more health tech experience than anyone in my close network, and if I ever have a question, I'd ask her. But have those go-to people who have different areas of expertise who you can go to for just support and advice and talking through problems. I think that really helps.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, and just add, like, it's a really healthy sign if you're hiring people who are much more experienced than you. Like, the bad version is you have some insecurity about what you're not as experienced in and you try to hold on to it forever. Like, those more experienced people will not only level up your company, but they'll level up you as a leader.
Ah, you should be a founder coach, Margaret. That was a gem.
Awesome. The next question is from Taylor Zhao. They ask, what are some harder to know red flags you've seen with hiring execs?
I mean, I think there's one of the things that's tricky about hiring execs is that they're very well spoken and they usually have good experience by the time they get to you. And they're pretty good at thinking on their feet and trying to pattern match and like say to you what would be helpful for you to hear. And so that can make understanding whether they're actually good at their job in the context of a company just like yours hard to know. So I think one, like certainly you should do like a lot of back channel referencing in advance, but when they're there, if things aren't going well, I think you need to be comfortable that it's okay if it doesn't work out. So this is like evading the question a little bit, but just to say like there might be red flags. It's a very low ratio of perfect hits in recruiting and certainly executive recruiting. Like executives turn over pretty fast, and you should not be scared if you've seen a pattern where it's just not working out. They're just not a match in the context of your company, and being okay parting ways.
It's a great point. Another one that I've used when designing interview plans and loops, because execs typically have such a broad area that they're responsible for, it's really easy for everyone to interview in a broad but shallow way. And I think that's where the awesome communication comes into play. And like, I think a lot of execs could just ace that kind of interview, but frankly have no idea what they're doing. So I think it's really important when you're designing loops. It's okay if you might miss some like broad gaps, but I would highly recommend almost every interviewer goes really deep in at least one area in their interview so they could really test, can this person talk about it, but have they actually done it before, and can they go really deep too?